Well, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me if this is the level of the microphone? Elton, you can't do that to me. Can you hear me if this is the level of the microphone? Even in the back? Good. Good. I know most everyone here, but just in case you don't know me, my name is Cathy Kolwey. I am a pastor and a chaplain. I'm currently the director of spiritual care at Auburn Homes and Services, which is an assisted living facility out in Carver County, multi-campus facility. And I like to talk about grief. And so I run regularly with my day job. I run a weekly grief group out of the Chaska Community Center. And who knew, right? I do a lot of things. And the coffee's coming. Thank you, Eric. I like to start on time, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. We are gonna spend 4 weeks together talking about grief. And so, we're gonna go over some goals. And then I'm going to ask you all just to kind of join me in a covenant together, because grief can be very vulnerable conversations, right? So, what are the goals for this class? Basically, what I want us to do is to develop a common language for talking about grief. We don't talk about grief well in our culture. We don't do it well. And so sometimes, even when you mean well, you just don't know what to say, right? And so we're gonna create some of that language. Yes?
Is that quality of not talking about it, is that true of human beings or of American culture particularly?
Well, how would you answer that question?
I don't know how other
I mean, I think it depends on the culture. I think my personal answer would be, I think Americans do it less well than some other cultures. And we may get into that later. But I think there's probably, you could also say, like, does Minnesota do it less well than the rest of the United States? You know, there's something to being that. And I will confess, I am that stoic German heritage. So.
When we were in New Orleans, we saw one of those where they have a jazz band.
Right.
And a Dixieland band and a big parade with the casket type of thing, you know.
Right.
They do funerals a little different.
They do funerals a little differently. So you could say it even between Louisiana and Minnesota. We do things differently. Yeah. And that's not to say that there's one right or one wrong. We just do things differently. So our first goal is to create a common language so that we can talk to each other about grief. Secondly, I hope that we provide safe space for one another so that, we can do a little bit of processing our own grief. And then ultimately, by the 4 weeks of this, I would love to hear your ideas about how we create grief support systems for this church together. What would that look like for you? But first we're going to build the language. Now, as I said, grief conversations can be very vulnerable. So I like for us to sort of enter into a covenant together. Here are my kind of 4 ground rules, but you guys get to add to those ground rules before we kind of agree this is what we're gonna do. First, when talking, let's all use I statements. That can sometimes be hard when it's a vulnerable thing to say. It's a lot easier to be like, well, everybody thinks, or, well, I've heard. Just use I statements as much as possible. Secondly, this is not group therapy, so I'm gonna ask that you do self-soothing. If something is a vulnerable moment and you find yourself tearing up or, just manage that yourself. Don't let it take over the group discussion. And I'll give you one little trick that I've learned along the way, is if you just rub your forefinger right there, like this. If you just go like this, that can help you soothe. You're more than welcome to also get up, get water, get coffee, do all of that kind of stuff. But we want to keep the conversations at the table, active. So, but if you do this, you'll give me a sign that maybe you're not there as well, and that'll help me kind of manage the group, okay? Third, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and what happens in grief group stays in grief group. Now, I do a lot of teaching this to pastors, so the way I say that to pastors is you're not allowed to use the stories that you hear right here in a sermon later on. Even if you change the names, you're still not allowed to use it. And then I always say, everybody's at different places. So you're allowed to get on the elevator wherever you want, and you're allowed to get off the elevator wherever you want. That's for my introverts and my extroverts, because there will be people who want to get on that elevator right away and take it all the way up to floor 80. There will be people who will get on at 2 and get off at 3. Do you know what I mean when I use that analogy? And wherever you're at in your sharing, that's okay. Everybody gets to get on the elevator and off the elevator wherever you want. And then I was telling the group before we started that I myself am an introvert, and that I am also a reflective processor. So I tend to think about things, and I can tell you what I think about the sermon usually by Tuesday morning. I can't tell you at coffee hour. I got to mull it over, okay? And so I provide space, the empty table, but feel free to move if you're feeling this way. The empty table has a sign on it that says, "For introverts only." And it gives people permission to sit at that table and not share, to do the activities as just a self-reflective, you can journal, you can write, you don't have to share, because not everybody likes sharing. So those are my ground rules. Is there anything else that the wisdom of the group would add to this? Anything else? If not, I would just say, if you could kind of turn to each other and agree to covenant in this way with one another, that you promise to, yeah, you can handle that, right? And that helps us to create that safe space so we can feel like we need to be vulnerable. It's okay to be vulnerable. The one and only other thing that I will add, and this is my own covenant to you all, is I am a person who uses humor as a coping strategy. And I need to tell you all that ahead of time. Number one, because that doesn't work for everybody, right? And number two, I am just going to apologize in advance that I might make a joke that you might not think is funny. But I know that about myself. I use humor as a coping strategy. And so I tell my grief groups, yes, you may cry, but you know what? We might also spend a lot of time laughing. And that is good therapy too. Sometimes people think they can't laugh when they talk about hard things, but we can, and we can do that together. And I'll lead the way. So, with that said, I'm going to have you pull out the sheet and the pen and start this as a reflective activity and just go through this list and circle anything that you've experienced, and it can be in the past year or two. Do it first as a self-reflective activity, and then I have some questions for you to share with one another. And if you are joining us online, welcome. The list that they're looking at is on the screen, and you can just kind of, if you're joining us online, you can go through and make a mental note of which ones. In the last year, I have experienced the following things. List, if it's not on there, there's a place at the bottom for list other, and you can feel free to write it in. And then as you finish that list, I would love for you, as you feel comfortable, to share with each other maybe one thing that you've circled and the story behind that, if you feel comfortable. And I also want you to talk about, was there anything on that list that is surprising to you?
Surprising that you listed it, or surprising that it affects us?
Well, answer it however you want. But no, but I would say surprising that I chose to list it on there. Yeah. You can share now.
breathing is good for us. I was there a month ago. One night. I know. I will say that I was treated tremendously well. Tremendous. I also think all those people that have worked in the hospital, they're going out of their way to be good people. Everybody deserves to be good to them. Then you're gonna get,
I would say maybe 2 minutes to make sure everybody gets.
and that's just,
Has everybody had an opportunity? I'll use you.
so they did blood draws every 4 hours to see where my level was. And when it got above, so my normal was 138. I was at 121. So the doctor said, when it's only 130, then we'll consider letting you go. So I was there from 10:30 in the morning, spent the night, and left at 6 o'clock. It claimed the anesthesia. Probably it's only many possibilities.
Okay, I'm going to bring us back together as a group. Has everybody who wanted to share had the opportunity to share? And then, is there anything from each of the tables that you would like to raise up for the entire group to hear? I can pass a microphone around, or I can repeat it as you say it. Just either anything that surprised you that was on the list, or anything specific that you would want to share. That actually came up at a table. And it really illustrates, I think, a good point in that any kind of change comes with grief, even good change. The day you get married, you start a grieving process where you grieve your single life. Oh, I wish I could go out with the girls again. Or, oh, I know some of you don't remember that. But, like every moment where we experience change or loss, even if it's good change, there is a huge grief process that happens when you launch kids successfully into adulthood. Right? And you're supposed to be happy. It's supposed to be a good thing. Like, they made it. And it still comes with grief. So even the good changes come with grief. Anything else? Yeah?
I think I think we all discover that in spite of our own problems, grief situations, there's always somebody that has something worse than we have.
Right. So for the people online, right. How can we dare sit in this room and talk about grief when we have watched the news of North Carolina? Absolutely. That it's not a contest, right? It's not a one-up-ya game that we all experience. And I actually think the opposite side of that coin is sometimes people experience grief over things that other people dismiss. And they don't get the empathy that maybe they need. So let's not, so this is a good, as we start to build the conversation with each other, let's be intentional about not, my grief is worse than your grief, or my grief is, thank God I don't have that grief. That's an important point too. So thank you for saying that. Anything else that you want to raise up for the whole group to hear? Yeah.
I thought a lot of these, they take you from a place where you were comfortable to almost like a naked feeling of uncomfortable, because it strips away how things were.
Right.
All of it changes things, even the being promoted, because then you're
Right.
not coworkers anymore, you're over here, you're alone again.
So if you're joining online, what she just said is that all of the things that are listed take you from a place of being comfortable to a place of being uncomfortable or feeling a little vulnerable. Even the good stuff, even the bad stuff. That it all takes you to this place of vulnerability, which is really hard to sit in and not try and cover. I heard at least one group have a write-in answer of losing a pastor. And that is not something that we name necessarily. We're going to get to the definition in just a second. But any kind of change, any kind of loss is going to bring grief with it. And so we sit in that vulnerability. Okay, I've put another sheet on your table that you can pass out. So I think this activity leads me into what is grief actually? What is the definition of grief? And I think you all are way ahead of some of the people I do grief work with, because many people, I will ask the question as the opening for my class, give me a definition of grief. And most people say something to the effect of, well, someone dies, and then you're sad for like a month. And then life goes back to normal. Those are people who have never lived in grief, right? So the real definition of grief is the response to any loss or change where a bond has been formed. Any loss or change where a bond has been formed. And although we conventionally think of grief as an emotional response, there is a lot of scientific research out there now that says that grief has physical responses, cognitive responses, behavioral responses, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical responses on top of just having an emotional response. So it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. Yes?
Due to the word loss, is grief always negative?
Repeat that into the mic.
Due to the word loss in your definition, is grief always a negative?
Elgin has just zeroed in on week 4, my final answer. Way to go, Elgin. You get the gold star for the day. No. I know Elgin, so I can tease him a little bit. You know, I think grief essentially is love. But it's kind of like love with nowhere to go. It's love that no longer has a container. And, you know, that will probably be one of the things you hear me say a lot, week after week after week after week. That at its core, grief is an expression of love. And so if you think that way, would you ever say, is love always negative? You wouldn't. But maybe grief is the negative side of love. But, you know, I told you, I tell jokes, right? I have said in the last 6 months of my life that I sometimes believe grief is my greatest joy. Now I'll just start to rub my own finger. That grief is my greatest joy. I have gotten to that after 6 years of a terrible, terrible grief journey. You know. And the other thing that I often say is, I come by my grief honestly. I've taken all the courses, you know, I've done all the continuing ed, but what makes me good at being a facilitator of grief is I have grieved in very, solid ways. So I come by it honestly. And I always feel really gentle about saying that. I usually don't say that in week one, that, I have come to believe that grief is my greatest joy. Because a lot of people who are in the midst of grief are not there yet. And to say that to a person who's maybe in like stage 1, stage 2 of grief, and you say like, oh, this may be one of the best things it's you can't say that to people who are on the journey. But I do believe that when you arrive, there is a positive side to grief. I believe that. I have 4 weeks to convince you of that. Yeah. I do. I have 4 weeks to convince you of that.
So one of the things that I just recently came to is as a result of some very severe, significant childhood grief, I've asked God a quadrillion times, yeah, right. And you hear things like, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, and all those cliches. And when you're a kid and you're in the midst of these really horrible things, and then you're a young adult and you're trying to be normal, what I realized just within the last 6 months is that those experiences, am I asking God, okay, now what? I realize that now when I see other people are grieving and having that experience that I had that's similar, that it grew empathy in me. And so for me, that's the joy. It's like, oh, hallelujah, it only took 50 years, but here we are.
Also, week 4. Zoom into the end. Yeah. And so on your sheet, the next part, it says loss and change can include any of the following. And this is an abbreviated list of what you circled in the very beginning. Death, divorce, retirement, empty nesting, loss of a pet. Let me tell you something funny. I just recently moved, and we decided to rehome our dog. Okay? Young dog, went to a very good friend of mine. We visited on the weekends, but we rehomed because we just don't have the time. And the day after it happened, I got this email from my toilet paper company, which I order my toilet paper from a company that calls itself Who Gives a Crap. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. And no, but here is what the line of the email said. It said, saying goodbye is hard, ... who gives a crap? And I was because it was the brand of the toilet paper, but I ended up in tears. That's what triggered me in that moment. And my dog is fine. It just is living in a better home, in a home that is with a retired person who can take much better care of it than I can. So we never know when grief is going to hit us, right? We never know what's going to be that trigger. We'll talk about that more. But loss of a pet, a move, a diagnosis, a job loss, loss of mobility, a traumatic event. I put these 1, 2, 3, because I think we are in grief from 3 more things. This is now me postulating. This is not the experts anymore, okay? 1, we are living in a post-pandemic world. And we are grieving the loss of the world that we knew. And I, quite honestly, think this is why we can't be nice to one another. Have you noticed that post-pandemic, nobody can seem to be nice to one another. We've lost that sense of decorum or that sense of, I believe it's because and we're not allowing ourselves to name it, right? We're not talking about it as grief, but we're grieving a post-pandemic. In the post-pandemic world, we're grieving the world that we knew beforehand. Does that touch anybody? Does it feel like it resonates?
We knew before COVID or we knew during COVID?
We knew before COVID. So today, we're still grieving, and we're going to do it as long as we don't name it and don't actually cry about it, don't allow ourselves to grieve. It's going to continue, So I would say we're in the anger phase. Yeah.
I had something this week. I had sort of put COVID completely out of my mind. And I never got COVID the first time around. But then I live out of Friendship Village, a retirement community, and they were giving some shots this week, and they were giving flu shots and COVID shots, and pretty much recommending that you take them both. And here they're bringing back into my mind something I'd almost put away. So the world is reminding us of some stuff.
Right.
And I say, well, it's probably for my own good, so.
Right, and we don't know. That again is grief. We don't know when it's going to come up or when it's going to get triggered or when it's going to be reminded of it.
Similarly, 9/11. It's sort of the same thing where for a lot of time you're not thinking about it, then the anniversary comes up and you can definitely say what it was like before and what it was like after, and it's so tangible when it comes up and it hits you, and my earliest memory was Kennedy being shot, but it's that kind of a transformative thing, and you're absolutely right. There's a before, and we can't get back to before. No how, no way.
Yeah. And I will say, I said I come by my grief honestly. I can name 5 events in my life that just transform, and I lived in New York City on 9/11. Yeah. We could talk about that all night long. Second thing that I always add to this that nobody thinks about, we who do racial justice work or social justice work go through continual cycles of grief. Even if you're not an active, think about when George Floyd happened in our city, right? Shock, denial, anger. What's next on the sheet? Bargaining, depression, acceptance. Collectively, the city of Minneapolis went through a grieving process. Well or not well, again, we could talk all night about whether we talk about this or not, but I believe that those of us who are justice-minded, who do that work, and I believe Meeting House Church does that we will constantly go through cycles of grieving as we do the difficult work. Third thing, and I say this lightly because I'm going to say it in a way that I don't believe it, but I believe that many of us are grieving, quote unquote, the death of the church as we know it. Now, I don't believe the church is dying. I actually have given sermon upon sermon about how I actually believe the church is going through a rebirth, and we're in the midst of a 50-year Reformation 2.0. But the church is changing. But many people describe it as the church is dying. Has anybody heard that language before? And whether you believe it or not, I don't believe it. But the more we use that language, the more we call ourselves into a grieving process.
You mean this church?
No, I mean big C, little c, church universal. Every denomination, everywhere, in this moment in time, is going through a rebirth. They're going through a reawakening. They're going through a reformation. And again, that's another whole class, 4 weeks, but I believe that, we have a lot of factors that were exactly like 1517. The first Reformation, we have a lot of very similar things happening in this day and age. So the church is changing. And there are growing pains, and there are aches of casting off old skin. And with all of that change is gonna come grief. And that's okay. It's okay to say, I wish it was the way it used to be. All of that is okay to do. So again, it's about creating this common language, right? Creating this common language together so that we can talk about it. And we don't have to talk about it in strictly negative ways, because Elgin has told us that grief is not always bad. Week four. So I just want to kind of stop here at this and say, what are your reactions? What are your yay, nay thoughts, feelings? Does anybody hear part of that and you have a tightness in your stomach or anything like that? Yeah.
I would say just name the idea of naming and recognizing and being heard, being understood, being seen in grief, knowing that makes a difference. So however that comes about. So I'm glad we are doing this.
Yeah, talking about it, naming it, seeing one another in it. That is the work that I love to do. That is the work that brings me joy. Oh, you have something on your sheet that I didn't put on a slide that is just the 5 stages of grief. Now, if anybody's done any grief work, you probably know these 5, right? So I don't know if this is new information or just returning information. But, it's the idea that we go through stages as we grieve. Shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and finally hope. We all want to go through it like this, right? We want a nice little sine curve or cosine curve to bring us through. That is never how it happens. You spiral up and spiral down, and you're back at denial, and you're all the way to hope, and then you're back at anger. And I always like to say, at this point, the second major thing that happened to me, one was 9/11, right? The second major thing, I lost my best friend Stacy 2 days after her 30th birthday. And I did her funeral. And that was probably, almost 18 years ago now. And I will say, I have been through all the stages. A song will come on the radio, or I will get a whiff of perfume, or something will happen. And I will just think to myself, oh my God, I just wish I could tell Stacy. And I am right back to denial once again. So this idea that you're going to grieve for a month and then be done, put that up on the shelf. Grief changes you forever, and that's a good thing. And, you know, you're going to experience it differently every moment of every day. So that's my long-winded way of saying, don't expect to move through those 7 stages quickly, easily, or in order. In order. Okay. I'm going to end promptly at 7:30, but in the next 10 minutes, what I want us to look at, and actually, can I get a couple people to pass these out for me so I can talk while they're being passed out? The American Psychiatric Society has broken up grief into 17 or 18 different types of grief. Now, I'm going to give you a sheet that has all the major ones on it. I want us to highlight just a couple, okay? Anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is what happens when, let's just say, case study, I find out that my mother gets a dementia diagnosis. She is still my mom. She is still kicking. She is still Nancy Kolwey, little spitfire that she is. But I start to grieve in that moment of all the future losses that are going to come. And, you know, when you have a senior in high school, you start thinking about, oh my God, I got 9 months and then they're going to be living in a different place. You start to grieve all of those changes. And so anticipatory grief, it is real. It is profound. And oftentimes what happens is when you, again, another example, my aunt was diagnosed with Parkinson's and lived with it for 12 years. And a cousin kind of became a caregiver. When she was at the funeral, people got mad at her because she wasn't really crying, right? And people were like, how dare you? But she had done all of her grieving every day prior for the 12 years before. And so for her, she felt relief, and then she felt guilty that she felt relief. We'll get to that week 3. But anticipatory grief, you grieve little losses every single day. It's huge. It's profound. Compound grief is another big one. And I would say, especially since we just talked about grieving the pre-COVID world, grieving a church that's in a rebirth, and grieving all of our social justice work, who doesn't carry compound grief, right? When I have a parent that I've become a caregiver for, and I have a child who is empty nesting, they've left in the last year or two, and I get my own, I don't know, pick a diagnosis. I get my own cancer diagnosis. I am now in compound grief because I'm grieving my parent, I'm grieving the launch of my child, and I'm grieving my own diagnosis, all at the same time. I would bet there's not a single person in this room that doesn't have some level of compound grief that they're carrying around every single day. And then you add in that other, I've just lost a pastor, you know, and here we are. Another important one that I want to talk about is ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is something that happens where either I don't recognize it within myself, or society does not validate my loss. Maybe it is something around mental health, because there's still a lot of stigma around that. So you're mourning a family member that has a mental health diagnosis, and everybody around you is just like, what are you worrying about? You know, maybe it is like you have a family and your family never acknowledged really the person that you chose to marry, or the person that you chose. For whatever reason, your family didn't accept that person into the family. And so you've kind of lived in a little bit of estrangement or something. And then that person dies, or that person gets sick, or that person, you know, and if the relationship wasn't validated to begin with, then the loss is not going to be validated either. Estrangement falls into this category in a big way. Like, if you have a fight with your best friend from high school and suddenly you never talk to them again, I don't know, pick a reason, because they stole your wedding shoes, you are going to feel ambiguous loss, because the world doesn't even grieve death well. So, you know, are they really going to be super empathetic to, I'm estranged from my high school best friend? You know, so ambiguous loss can be huge. I would put loss of a pastor in ambiguous loss. Because a lot of people are going to say to us, I'll say it this way, a lot of people are going to say to us, it's just business, and you get another one, and you know, it's HR, and it's not. We are going to experience ambiguous loss together. And so let's find language to name it and to talk about it. Gently. And I'll end here, back at the 7 stages of grief. As a pastor, I will joke a lot and say, this is why funerals are hard. The 7 stages of grief are why funerals are hard. Because inevitably, mom dies and you got 4 children. You know where I'm going with this, right? And those 4 children, one of them shows up angry, one of them shows up in denial, one of them shows up and is sitting in the corner crying and depressed, and one of them has gotten to hope. How are those 4 children going to interact with each other, right? This is why funerals are as emotional as they are. Because if I'm angry, I don't want to see my sister's tears, and I don't want to hear my brother's denial. And I certainly don't want that younger brother coming at me with all of that hope. What? I'm not ready for that. This is, now, I say that as a joke about a funeral. But my final thought for today is going to be, how are we showing up at church with one another? And wouldn't it be a blessing? Wouldn't it be a phenomenal gift to one another if I could walk through the door and just say, Sally, I'm a little angry today. And that Sally could say back to me, yeah, I'm kind of depressed myself. And could we care for one another in that way by building a common language and by really being vulnerable and honest with each other about where we are in the moment? It's going to be different every single day, too. What's your question or what's your thought?
It's so different today because most people do cremation. Yeah. But back when my grandparents died and, the people from that era, you couldn't just wait, they could die right before Christmas in a snowstorm and you still had to have the funeral because the body wouldn't last in the casket. So you were right away having this funeral where when my brother died and my father and my mother, well, because it was cremated, then of course they all died like in February or March, but we all waited till June when the weather was beautiful. But that's kind of different because it's so far removed from the death. Yeah. But with cremation, you can do that because a lot of obituaries will say the service won't be like next week. It'll be 6 months from now.
And it's a celebration of life at that point. They often don't call it. And I will tell you a story about that. At one of my previous churches where I served, one of the core families lost one of their sons when he was 16. And they had him cremated, and they had a memorial service at the time, but they didn't really like the pastor that was in the church, so it was very small and very minimal. And they came to me and said, Cathy, we love you as a pastor, and we're finally ready. And I buried the urn in his gravesite plot 10 years after they had the funeral, because they were not ready to let that child go. That child, his life ended way too soon, and that urn sat in their living room for 10 years. But they had to be ready. They had to be ready. It was one of the most meaningful services that I've done. And it ended up with a tornado warning. There was we had this big wind and rain, and they said, this is Matt crying from heaven. They were so ready for that rain to come. It was, so yes, cremation does change everything. So I like to start and end on time. It is 7:30. Are there any final thoughts? If not, I like to end with a meditation. So I will ask you all to close your eyes and take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. And I'm going to end with this blessing for those who hold space. And this is my thank you for being here and being willing to hold space for your grief. You are the ones who live wholeheartedly and courageously. You are the ones who dare to dive beneath the surface of human emotions. You are the ones who show up and keep showing up, Even when grief is as vast as the ocean and fear is as unimaginable as a volcano, you are the ones who reach past the unknown, who hold that which is liminal, nebulous, and layered with complexity. Whenever you do this hard and holy work, whenever you show up with hands trembling and your hearts fluttering, may you know that you are not alone and that you have what you need for this moment. May you remember that we are woven together, and may you trust that you can lean into the container that mystery and community hold out to you. As your work deepens to hold what the future brings, may your intuition and discernment deepen with it. May the tenderness and grace which you offer others be available to you in equal measure. And may you remember to let joy in. Even when you feel uncertain and wobbly, may you trust your own wisdom and courage. And may you find those who can hold space for you. Remember to honor the limits of your capacity and to let love always be your guide. Amen. You guys can continue to talk at the tables if you want, and I will leave you with just the thought to be gentle with yourselves and one another.